In Jamaica, if you're running a lottery scam on old people in America, you know the name Steve Dixon's. Names, phone numbers, home addresses of elderly Americans, $500 a pop. Steve Dixon was so famous that a Jamaican artist put his name in a song lyric. But Steve Dixon isn't real. His real name is Troy Murray. He lives in Hickory, North Carolina, and he just got sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for selling the personal data of 7 million seniors. Troy was 57 years old when federal prosecutors finally caught up to him. He'd been running this operation out of Hickory since 2016. 7 years. 7 years of selling people's personal information to scammers in Jamaica who would call up elderly Americans, tell them they'd won a sweepstakes or a lottery prize, and then convince them to send money to claim their winnings. The classic telemarketing scam, older than the internet, and Troy was the guy feeding those scammers their targets. The way it worked was simple. Troy would compile lead lists of elderly Americans, names, phone numbers, home addresses, sometimes financial details. He packaged these up and sold them to buyers in Jamaica who were running telephone fraud operations. Each list had somewhere between 100 and 300 names on it, and he charged around $500 per list. $500 for a list of your grandparents' personal information. That was the going rate. And Troy wasn't small time about it. Over 7 years, federal investigators say he sent at least 22,000 lists to scammers in Jamaica. 22,000. If you do the rough math on that, at $500 per list, you land somewhere around $11 million in gross sales. Prosecutors pegged his actual take at $5.2 million. Either way, Troy was making serious money selling old people's data to criminals in another country. Now, the scam itself cruel in its simplicity. Someone in Jamaica picks up a phone, calls a 78-year-old woman in Ohio, and tells her she's won $200,000 in a foreign lottery. All she needs to do is pay the taxes via processing fee. And the caller is warm, patient, friendly. They call back every day. They build a relationship. Some of these scammers spent weeks grooming a single victim before asking for money. And they could do all of that because Troy had given them the name, the number, and the address to start with. The victims on those lists lost over $9.5 million to the Jamaican scammers who bought Troy's data. $9.5 million from people in their 70s and 80s who picked up their landlines and believed someone on the other end. Some of them sent checks. Some wired money through Western Union. Some mailed cash in envelopes because the voice on the phone told them that was the safest way to claim their winnings. And every single one of those calls started with a list that Troy Murray sold from his house in Hickory, North Carolina. Some of these victims lost their entire savings. We're talking about retired people on fixed incomes who sent $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to a scammer they thought was a lottery official, and when the money ran out, the calls kept coming. Sometimes the scammers would tell a victim they needed to send more to unlock the next payment, and the victims would borrow money from family members to keep paying. That is what Troy's data enabled. That is what $500 per list bought. Now, Troy didn't use his real name for any of this. He went by Steve Dixon, and Steve Dixon became a brand. In Jamaica's lottery scam world, if you needed fresh leads on elderly Americans, Steve Dixon was the guy you called. He had a reputation. He was reliable. He always had new names. The lists were accurate. Steve Dixon delivered. Troy got so embedded in this ecosystem that a Jamaican recording artist referenced Steve Dixon in a song lyric in 2022. His fake name, that is a level of criminal fame that most people never achieve in their actual careers, let alone under an alias. Troy Murray, a guy in rural North Carolina, had become a folk figure in Jamaica's scam economy, and nobody in his actual life had any idea. The money trail tells you everything about how Troy operated. For years, he was getting paid through wire transfers, Western Union, MoneyGram, the usual channels. Buyers in Jamaica would wire payments to Troy after receiving a list. Simple, fast, traceable. But eventually, those services started flagging his transactions. Too many incoming transfers from Jamaica. Too frequent. Too consistent. The pattern was obvious to anyone running compliance software, so Troy adapted. When the wire services started blocking him, he switched to prepaid gift cards. Buyers in Jamaica would purchase prepaid cards and send Troy the card numbers and PINs. He'd drain the cards on his end, a low-tech fake workaround that money flowing even after the legitimate transfer services cut him off. I mean, think about that. The wire services flagged this guy and he just pivoted to gift cards like it was a minor business inconvenience. That's not a guy who panicked. That's a guy who treated this like a job. And what did Troy spend his millions on? Not yachts, not penthouses in Miami, farm equipment, vehicles, gold and silver coins, bars, that kind of thing. Troy was a rural North Carolina, guy making millions from an international data brokering operation and spending it on tractors and precious metals. If you're wondering why federal investigators had trouble spotting this sooner, that spending profile probably didn't scream international fraud kingpin to anyone running surveillance in Hickory. Troy also brought his family into the business. His son, Cutter Murray, got involved in laundering the proceeds. Cutter handled about $1.6 million of the money. That is not a small cut. That is some chunk of the total operation. Cutter eventually pled guilty to money laundering charges. He admitted to processing funds and helping move money through the system. Father and son, running an operation together that turned elderly Americans' personal data into cash and farm equipment. If you've been watching this and want more crime stories, hit subscribe. New ones drop all the time. The federal investigation that brought Troy down involved multiple agencies working across international borders. The FBI has been tracking Jamaican lottery scam networks for years. These operations target thousands of Americans annually, and the total losses across all victims run into the hundreds of millions. Troy was a supply-side player in that machine. He didn't make the calls himself. He didn't run the scam scripts. He didn't talk to a single victim. He provided the raw material, the names and numbers that made the entire fraud engine work. Without guys like Troy, the callers in Jamaica have nobody to call. He was the supply chain. And the scale of what Troy built deserves a second look. 7 million names. That is not a rounding error. That is roughly the population of Massachusetts. Troy Murray had the personal data of enough elderly Americans to fill an entire state. And he was selling that data, batch by batch, to people whose entire business model was calling those seniors and lying to them until they sent money. When federal agents finally arrested Troy, they seized everything. The farm equipment, the vehicles, the precious metal collection he'd built up over 7 years of selling data. Prosecutors moved to forfeit $5.2 million, which they calculated as the total proceeds Troy personally earned from the scheme. $5.2 million. From selling lists of old people's phone numbers out of a house in Hickory. Troy went to trial and was convicted. In May 2026, a federal judge sentenced him to 121 months in federal prison. That is just over 10 years. He was also ordered to forfeit the full $5.2 million. The judge did not go easy on him. The sentencing reflected the scope of what Troy had done and the vulnerability of the people he'd helped target. At 57, Troy will be close to 70 when he gets out. His son Cutter is facing his own sentencing after pleading guilty to laundering $1.6 million of the proceeds. And I keep coming back to the song lyric. A Jamaican artist put Steve Dixon's name in a track. Troy built such a reliable, high-volume operation that scammers turned his fake name into a cultural reference. He became known for one thing: selling the personal information of people's grandparents. That was his legacy. That was the thing he was famous for in a criminal economy running hundreds of miles offshore. Meanwhile, the people on those lists, the 7 million seniors whose names Troy packaged and sold, most of them never understood why the scam calls started. They just picked up the phone one day and someone told them they'd won something. And they believed it. Because the caller had their name, address, and their phone number. The caller knew who they were. It felt real, because Troy had made it real by handing their information to someone who knew exactly how to use it. Cutter pled guilty. Troy got 10 years. The operation is shut down. But 7 million names don't disappear from the scam ecosystem just because the guy who sold them is sitting in a federal facility. Those lists get copied, resold, shared, and recycled by other brokers. The phone calls keep coming. They just find someone else to buy from. Troy Murray spent 7 years as the most connected data broker in Jamaica's lottery scam world. He built a brand under a fake name, earned millions, bought gold coins and tractors, and brought his own son into the business. He got so famous that someone put his alias in a song, and now he's sitting in federal prison for the next decade, ordered to hand back every dollar he made. 10 years for selling your grandmother's phone number to scammers in Jamaica. If you ask me, some people earn their sentences. If you want more stories like this, they're on the channel.